Welcome to the CAA 2020 Explore webinar series. Today we have the Sustainability in Ambulance Victoria webinar with Sally Mangan, supported by Mercedes-Benz. Thank you for joining us and please enjoy.
Welcome to our CAA monthly webinar, designed to bring you speakers on current hot topics, new innovations and ideas from around the Australasian ambulance sector. My name is David Waters and I'm the Chief Executive of the Council of Ambulance Authorities. Today we hold our first webinar on a sustainable ambulance sector. I'm excited to welcome a fabulous presenter, Sally Mangan, who will share with us the road to a more sustainable ambulance Victoria. But before we hear from Sally, let's look at the steps that CAA is taking for a more sustainable sector, including Australia, New Zealand and PNG. I'd like to welcome Moitza, the General Manager from the CAA, who's a bit of an eco-warrior herself and who helped set up our sector-wide sustainability strategy. Welcome, Moitza.
Thank you, David, for the introduction, and welcome everyone. I'm very excited to have the chance to talk to you about CAA sustainability strategy. I guess how it all kicked off was last year we commissioned a report from Paul Frasca, who runs the sustainability salons here in Australia and New Zealand. And we really wanted him to go out and interview and visit ambulance services across Australia and New Zealand to really see what the capacity for, I guess, a more sustainable future looks like in ambulance services, which was really wonderful because he went out, visited sites, saw what's being done in terms of waste management, rain sort of retention, water recycling, energy and all of that. And he provided a great report that we shared with our board, but also then did a wonderful presentation closing off the 2019 CAA Congress last year in Perth. And I guess the feedback from industry was just wonderful. So everybody was really excited that we did dive into sustainability and that we sort of really went out and looked at what the capacity is. So I guess the next step for us from then was putting together a CAA sustainability strategy. So the strategy very much looks at the main pillars of sustainability. So carbon emissions, water use and recycling, energy use, and also waste management and recycling. Really, those were identified as the key pillars for ambulance services that they can do the biggest changes and I guess the quickest changes in a way as well. So those ones. In addition to those, we very much then looked at procurement and supply chain, which will probably be a bit of a longer discussion, but given that CAA has got really great partnerships with our partners and sponsors, we're hoping we can make some changes there as well, but also sort of looking at how and what a sustainable community looks like, what a sustainable workforce and a sustainable working environment looks like as well. So that's, I guess, the key points for the strategy. I guess the next steps for us very much are about sharing interesting tips and facts around how we can be more sustainable. And I'm hoping you would have seen that already through the CAA social channels, but also in our new magazine first, and also through our newsletters and whatnot. That's the plan going forward, is very much sort of every 3 months trying to hand out a whole bunch of interesting facts and tips, looking overseas and looking to other industries at what they do, sharing those case studies, and then talking to the vendors and our suppliers in this space, looking at what are the better, the more sustainable options for us to do business with. So that is CAA sustainability strategy in very short. Part of it is us educating, is raising awareness, and that's why we've been engaging in social media. We've been asking our members and our partners to share the tips and ideas that we're putting together, and today's webinar is very much a part of that. So it's very much about raising awareness around the fact that ambulance services and ambulance sector in Australia and New Zealand is very committed to trying to be more sustainable. And while we understand this is going to be a long road, we know every little step counts. So today we bring to you Sally Mangan from Ambulance Victoria, who is actually the first Director of Sustainability. We're really excited that Ambulance Victoria has really jumped in to sustainability and are making some really wonderful strides and changes. But I'll leave that to Sally. Thank you very much for joining us, and follow us more. And like I said, we'll be very much regularly updating our sustainability action plan and sharing ideas, and hopefully you can find those really valuable and get them on deck, and we can start making some really great changes for a better future for all of us. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon.
Thank you, Moitza. We look forward to seeing changes around the CAA member services and sharing with everyone great ideas and solutions for a more sustainable ambulance sector. Now, to hear from a service that is taking great steps on the sustainability road, we're very happy to bring to you Sally Mangan from Ambulance Victoria, who is the first Director of Sustainability for AV, but is also one of the very rare people across Australasian ambulance services whose role is solely committed to sustainability. Over the last 2 years, Sally has flown AV's sustainability flag, and in a short time, AV's has adopted their first social and environmental responsibility framework, including an action plan. They've also set up a sustainability team and commenced implementing priorities from the plan, and just recently signed up to a power purchase agreement for AV sites across Victoria, switching them over to 100% green power, renewable energy. A great initiative. All of us know that getting an ambulance service to go green is not an easy task, and it's great to hear how AV has tackled the challenge and what they've learnt to date and prepared to share with us so far. So without further ado, please welcome Sally Mangan from Ambulance Victoria.
Hello everybody. Thank you to David and team for having me along today. My name is Sally Mangan and I am the Director of Sustainability at Ambulance Victoria. I'd first off like to acknowledge the traditional custodians for the land on which we virtually meet today and acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging. I'm going to be sharing with you today some of our journey for sustainability at Ambulance Victoria, and I hope you enjoy it. So sustainability at Ambulance Victoria, we talk to this in terms of calling it social and environmental responsibility, but just briefly, to talk on the definition of sustainability, often refer to it from a very early definition from the mid-1980s, referring to it as sustainable development, which is really about being able to meet the needs of the present, but without compromising the ability or the needs of future generation for their own needs. So it's around a balance of systems, and it is quite an old definition, being 30 years old today, but I do still believe it's relevant. In the context of what does it mean for us and what does it mean for an ambulance service, to make sure that our development and our business practice is sustainable and doesn't take away from future generations. So specifically for Ambulance Victoria, why did we do this? Why did we create a sustainability strategy and a team? We had a number of reasons for doing that. So part of it was strategic, being a high-performing organisation and being a sustainable organisation is part of one of our key outcomes from our strategic plan on high performance. However, there are also some regulatory reasons in train or in place that really necessitated the need for EV to start becoming more sustainable and more direct in its sustainability efforts. So a good example is the Sustainability Strategy for Environment from the Department of Health in Victoria, as well as the Victorian Climate Change Act that sets that vision for Victoria to be net zero emissions by 2050. As well as that, however, there's community expectations and they are changing. And the expectations of the community to want a health service to be sustainable, and that's something that they believe that AV should be, as well as our own workforce. So our workforce has shifted quite a lot in the demographics in the last 5 to 10 years. We have a growing millennial or a younger workforce that values a company's social and environmental responsibility. And for us, that was important of listening to what the new makeup of our workforce valued as well. And finally, trust. So when we started this piece of work, I think the Banking Royal Commission was happening at the time. And there was a lot of discussion around traditional institutions that perhaps had lost community trust or people's trust. and that it needed to reset going forward. So we thought in taking on a broader piece of work for responsibility and being a responsible business or organisation as an ambulance service, what did that mean for us? As well as looking at the why, it's important context for us to have of the what. So our annual impact of running an ambulance service, and this was for financial year 18-19 at a summary level, does have an impact, both positive and negative. So we need to consider that as a service, we definitely deliver service benefits, but that we also do have a footprint or a harm that we can do and an impact from our service itself. So, we respond to an incredible number of incidents and Victorians receive our care, but by doing that, we're required to drive a lot of kilometres, have a lot of staff, invest in community engagement activities, but we also use a lot of floor space and energy to do that, as well as have a significant vehicle profile. So that impact, be it positive and negative, is something that we've started to consider from a social and an environmental perspective. When we set about to develop our framework, we really looked for what are social and environmental impacts. So we didn't purely look at it from an environmental lens. We wanted to take a wider view. And we ran some engagement workshops with different internal and external stakeholders. And we started to come up with some priorities and really some themes out of that input from our stakeholder groups. So we heard about patients and best care. We heard about our people. We heard certainly about the environmental impact of our business, but also about things coming up like climate change, or even how we buy and purchase. So from the engagement activities, we came up with 4 key themes or priority areas that would make up our strategy and framework. So this is our strategy on a page, and our vision is that if we're a responsible business, that we enhance the delivery of best care to our patients. And it does focus on the themes of people, community, supply chain, and environment. So our framework's grounded by those 4 areas or principles. So for people, it's about a great place to work and volunteer. For community, it's about engagement and investment and volunteerism with our communities. For social impact, environment is about responsibly managing the environmental impact of AV. And then supply chain is about collaborating with the right suppliers. It's about thinking about the way we source and being responsible for that. So taking that strategy on a page, how are we getting there in terms of sustainability? We have a number of projects that I'm going to take you through today so you can get a little bit of an idea of our efforts in this space. So the strategy itself then was translated into a 5-year period for an action plan. So we developed key actions across those 4 areas of our strategy across people, community, environment, and supply chain. We linked those to the Sustainable Development Goals as well that a few of you might have heard of from the United Nations. So there's some goals that link in with the vision for the future of what sustainable development looks like. And we commenced implementation of that about 12 months ago now. So we're just coming into the early stages of the 2nd year of delivering against that action plan. But that gives us something to guide against the strategy to make sure that we realise that vision of being a socially and environmentally responsible organisation. So our first project or case study example is change management and sustainability. So in the first year, we really invested quite a lot of time around establishing a base for communicating and engaging with our people and also with our external stakeholders. So we, in a staff survey, we baselined the current measure of engagement out of 10 for sustainability, the AV. We also started up some newsletters and formed some checklists for behavioural or work practice change, both at work within our AV workplace, but also giving people suggestions for at home. So we know that this is a behavioural change piece in becoming more sustainable. So we linked up behaviours and examples related to, for instance, waste, so people could have some practices that they could apply both at home and at work. We now have a group of sustainability representatives or change champions that's growing. It's more than 100 at the moment. And then we've also developed a presence on our internal workplace or social media group that really is a place where we can share about our local actions across some like minds for sustainability within the ambulance service. And then the final piece that we've been working on in the last month or two is starting a podcast series from this month. So we're going to be interviewing people within AV, or if not, people outside of AV that are doing great work in health and sustainability, and sharing that with the group. So that's a new piece of work that we've picked up this year. And really, at the end of the day, social and environmental responsibility for us is about our impact. So each of our projects does link back to what are the outcomes that we were seeking to realize from the sustainability strategy. So for this one, it's really increasing that level of sustainability engagement within the workforce. Local action, really at a ground level at our branches or at our local offices, has been fantastic in the last 12 months and certainly surprised me. We've got a few examples here around worm farming and recycling and gardening. We even have a few branches that do monthly or regular sustainability tracking and share that with the local team. So you can see an example there from one of the branches in the Melbourne office that have set up some waste streams for recycling of coffee cups and organics and soft plastics, and are proactively doing that themselves. So, certainly the impact that we're seeking out of that is that it's local ownership. So we have a central piece of work that, certainly will drive programs across ambulance, but there's been great activity locally that's driven by those representatives or champions that I discussed earlier. So it's a really good example and a link to people's well-being as well, of a few people being out in the garden have commented that they really enjoy doing that in and around their work, and that it certainly helps to green up and involve some of the local paramedics in some projects. Another specific program that we've looked at is around waste management. So this is around setting up a trial for further waste separation, and it links into the Victorian government has identified some further streaming of waste such as glass into the next few years. So we wanted to trial how can we start looking at a local level, albeit a little bit ahead of where the government, bins and waste streams may be, of looking at some local collections of different waste streams. So soft plastics, for instance, we've got some keen people out at branches that collect that, and that they take it down to the local supermarkets, and that they basically put up some posters themselves or put up notices and encourage that better waste management at the local branches. So really outcome from that at the moment is we have more than 100 of our branches across Victoria participating in the trial, and the end impact that we're seeking from that is reducing the amount of waste that's going to landfill, as well as increasing the understanding of the paramedics and of our corporate staff as well, where it's operating in some of our offices or will going forward, that they understand the different waste streams that it is possible to separate waste into. Of note, one or two of our local representatives have actually done some of their own waste audits and found items that should potentially be going into the sharps bin or biohazard bags that were in normal rubbish. So use that as an education or an awareness process locally. They've found as well the large amount of recycling going into normal waste. So use that as an opportunity where they have done some quick waste assessments themselves to then engage with their local staff on that. So waste has certainly been, really in the first year, quite a popular item. And for us to trial that gives us a good understanding of where should our waste streams go into the future, and how could we then from a system level start to support that learning. Another project that has started probably a little bit over 12 months ago now is led by two paramedics within AV, and it's more on a social and environmental project. So they're looking to find new or reuses for old uniforms. So they've in the course of the 12 to 18 months they've been operating, increased the use of the AV uniforms exponentially. Sometimes they're shared back across, but often they're donated to local groups in need. So a few examples locally have been some of the hospital patients presenting to an ED if they need some clothes, for instance, because they're not in a state, their clothes when they come in, where they may need some new ones. It's also gone to services overseas for ambulance, as well as some of the local charity shops, and recently with some farmer relief into the Gippsland region. So you can see not only does it go locally though, but it also goes international to refugee camps. So to date, the team behind that have donated more than 13,000 items, and they work strongly with the local community. So the community down in Gippsland, the Lions and the Rotary clubs, we must acknowledge their help in debadging a lot of the uniforms, but it's fantastic to think of the number of items that would have gone to landfill or through to a waste stream that was less than ideal and have now found alternate use through this program. Another piece that we're working on for more so around our supply chain priorities and our social responsibility is the way that we procure. So the Victorian Social Procurement Framework was released about 2 years ago now, and is really something that the procurement team at Ambulance Victoria is embedding into their business as usual practices. So social procurement, from a definition point of view, is about using our buying power to generate social value. So there are a number of objectives that sit behind the social procurement for social impact. So it might be opportunities for Victorians with a disability or women's equality, but it also supports environmental objectives such as environmentally sustainable practices and implementation of climate policy. So in working with the procurement team, a good example recently has been that during COVID-19, it did lead to a requirement to provide some ambulance cleaning services across Victoria. And in Gippsland, specifically, a social enterprise supported AV to find some qualified contractors that could support that need. And that program really looked at some outcomes around providing opportunities for disadvantaged Victorians in the Gippsland region, and focused on that local spend being focused on generation of social value. So in the last 12 months, Ambulance Victoria has established its own social procurement framework, and we're working towards embedding that, as I mentioned, into procurement practices, both large and both small, because they can make a difference when it comes to the decisions on how and what we buy. Another new area is on social impact measurement that we've been looking at. So we were really lucky last year. We partnered with a research project with the Australian New Zealand School of Government, ANZSOG, and their research project, where we had a team of students looking at it, was honed down around how can AV most effectively measure the impact of our community engagement activities. So they spent a semester-long project looking for us at the way that we could set up and understand and evaluate the impact of AV's community activities. So it was a really valuable piece of work for us to partner with the students, where they took and applied a program theory approach or a program logic, and then created a logic model for us to take forward and embed into our community engagement team and practices. So it really focused on looking at the theory of change, and I've provided a highlight there of the logic model that walks through inputs and activities, but then starts to consider the short and medium term outcomes that are interacting and then contribute to an overall impact. The overall impact that we were looking at measuring for this research was the improved community health resilience, so that our community engagement activities are all about having that impact into the Victorian community. But how do we better understand and measure that and evaluate it going forward? So while it's an early piece of work for us to now adopt that logic model and a framework into our community engagement programs, the impact that we're seeking out of that is embedding the notion of social value, impact and measurement into our business as usual processes. And we're certainly looking at exploring that into the future further, albeit even, into a question around how could we measure and understand the impact of volunteering and volunteerism at AV, for example. So it's an early update on that for now. One of the other case studies I wanted to talk through, and this one is a little bit more detailed, this is around that vision of a sustainable ambulance service or an Ambulance Victoria at 2050. So this really looks at our plan that's genuinely aimed at limiting global warming and how do we realise that. So, at 2050, I imagine we would be a net zero ambulance service with a zero emissions fleet and properties that source renewables for their energy requirements, but also that in the face of a changing climate that we're adapted and resilient to climate change in Victoria. We don't produce very much waste from our service, and that we're responsibly sourcing or interacting with our supply chain in a responsible way. And finally, as well, you might have heard the notion of a low carbon model of care. This is really starting to be discussed across sustainable healthcare forums around understanding what does a low emission healthcare service look like. So it's certainly something that at 2050, I would expect to see Ambulance Victoria being a lower carbon or a zero carbon model of care service. So this links back to our overall strategy. So the Lancet Health publication from 2015, I think really says it quite well in terms of the link between climate change and health. The effects of climate are being felt today and will be felt into the future. And it does represent a risk to human health. And so it's why doubly it's important for us as Ambulance Victoria to really be on the front foot of climate action and making sure that we're taking it seriously as a responsible part of our business. So in Victoria specifically, the climate itself is changing already, but into the future, we expect to see more extreme of weather and climate. So hot days could double by the 2050s. Generally with climate change, we can expect temperature increase, rain to decrease, however, with more intense rainfalls, harsher fire risk, as well as longer seasons, and rising sea levels. So projections alone to 2100 predict 1.1 metres of sea level rise, for example, in some of the modelling. So, it's something even in terms of our coastal region that we need to take into consideration in planning. The links between climate and health, I won't go into detail of a lot of this infographic, but really, the takeaway from this is that there are the direct effects of, flood or a heat wave, for instance, but there are also the indirect effects. And I think probably the bushfires over the last summer are a good example of that, of the fires, but then the impact into air pollution, and then how that interfaces with a health impact further down. So be it respiratory impact, or it could be allergies, and also the psychological impact that a number of climate events have on mental health can't be underestimated as well. So while I won't go through this in an awful lot of detail, it's really important to think of those direct, indirect, and then linked to the health impacts. So the current state of Australian health, when we think of what is our impact and ambulance services, the health impact at the moment has been estimated by a study a few years ago as representing 7% of Australia's total emissions. So compared to the UK or the US, we're probably about in the middle. The UK represents about 3% and the US 10% in comparison. But, when you think about 7% for health as a sector of Australia's total emissions, it's still fairly significant. And one of those reasons why we, as Ambulance Victoria, are looking at this and wanting to reduce our emissions. Ambulance services specifically, there was a study a little while ago now that looked at the footprint of Australian ambulance operations. So not insignificant in itself at the time. It was over 100,000 tonnes of carbon per annum. But you can see that the profile is around 70% from its fleet operations, be it ground fleet or air, and up to about 30% from its energy and other fuel sources. Of note, the air transport is a lot more intensive in terms of emissions than ground fleet, so something that needs to be taken into consideration for planning on reduction of impact as a service. The profile is a little bit different compared to hospitals. Hospitals tend to be really the other way around of usually predominantly their energy impacts, with a little bit from fleet and other sources. So specifically what we're doing around this at Ambulance Victoria at the moment is we took a look at the climate mitigation side of things first. So you will hear for climate action that there are two main areas of action. There's mitigation, which is around reducing emissions. And then there's also adaptation. So that's about adapting to a changed environment. So mitigation seeks to stop climate change happening, whereas adaptation is about making sure that you're ready in the face of a changing environment and climate. So our work around climate mitigation really started with working backwards from being net zero at 2050 and is planned around a phased transition. So we have three key areas of emissions as an ambulance service, as was mentioned before in the Australian example: road fleet, our buildings, and our air fleet. And what we've done to date is actually calculated back from being net zero and looked at the specific reductions that we can make in the next 5 and 10 year periods at 2025 and 2030 to reduce our specific carbon emission impact. So of note, we have an additional challenge when we look at our base year of 2015. We've actually increased in the face of growth in that period as well in our emissions against our baseline. So while we are planning a trajectory for reductions, we're also doing it against a business that's growing in demand and growing in impact. So we have a double challenge there. The impact we're really seeking from this, though, is something I mentioned before when we looked at the vision for 2050. So this is around lowering our carbon intensity and having a lower overall carbon model of care. So when we think about patient care, this is about the carbon intensity per patient and starting to even benchmark and measure ourselves against others to make sure that as we are reducing, we're becoming more efficient in how we serve patients and the intensity at which we do it. Of note, we should be able to share soon what those emissions reduction pledges look like for the next 5 and 10 years. So we'll be happy to share those with you soon when they're ready to go. For emissions reduction, we have developed a vision specifically on energy that we can share with you today. So we are committing to source 100% of our electricity from renewable sources by 2025. So in July this year, we went live with a power purchase agreement for some of our large sites, a few of our social media channels. That reduced our overall emissions as an ambulance service by 7% from middle of this year, which was a really good achievement. And you can see a lovely picture there of a wind farm in Victoria where we're sourcing the accreditation for renewable energy from. But, you know, there's certainly an impact that we're wanting to meet by 2025, which would mean that we'd have a 27% reduction in our emissions from transitioning to renewable sources in the next few years. While we've achieved, you know, a really great outcome just this year, we've still got a long way to go to get to that 27% impact in the next 5 years. As well as reducing emissions, it's really important to think about the efficiency of our portfolio as well. This is where we start to intersect between, we've got an existing portfolio of, I think, 300 to 350 buildings across Victoria. So we have started a program of work that's installing on-site solar that also looks at lighting improvements to LEDs, for example. And this year we are trialling a battery site at one of the branches. So looking at what impact does battery have in conjunction with solar, and also just exploring around energy resilience. This starts to link in a little bit with climate change, and that energy resilience and energy security is really important in the face of changed and extreme weather events. So the impact that we're seeking out of that is that we better the building efficiencies at the moment, but that also, on the other hand, that we also think very differently about our future buildings and how they look and how they operate. This year we have developed a ESD standard, which stands for an environmentally sustainable design standards. That looks at various principles around environmental design and well-being of design. So we design better, and we also design to be climate adapted and resilient. So we have a design concept project that's underway at the moment, and that links with a project with the master's students for engineering and architecture at the University of Melbourne that's funded by a grant from the ARENA organisation federally, which is the Renewables Energy Agency federally. So we'll be really looking to what outcomes come from that design project, and can we build a net zero emissions branch, given that the life of the branches that we're building at the moment, could be in the 40 to 50 year category and would take us past 2050 at this point. And the impact that we're really seeking out of that is a decrease immediately to the environmental footprint when we start building those future-proofed buildings. The other side of climate change, as I mentioned before, is climate adaptation. So this is around adapting and being resilient to a changing climate. So our vision here is that a sustainable ambulance service is one that's resilient to the effects of climate change. An example is the bushfire season that we had just recently last summer. Air quality was impacted to a hazardous level, and our example data from one night alone was that we had calls to AAA spike or increase by more than 51% for breathing difficulties that night alone. As I mentioned before, climate change is expected to bring more severe fire events and longer seasons, and you can see that that's the downstream effect then of one of those indirect impacts on air quality from a fire or a heat event that then impacts into the health system. The focus for ambulance has been that we've added climate change to our risk register, and we've created a risk assessment for climate itself and are focused at the moment of fully understanding the impacts of climate change to our business. And part of that's also taking forward-looking data or considering climate futures and projections, and not just relying on historical data when it comes to this, because we know that the future events and hazards will either look slightly different or at least be more of a compound effect and likely to occur concurrently. So our work this year is really focused on developing a climate adaptation plan, and this centres around building climate decision making and building climate change into business continuity planning, into our emergency response framework, and looking also about skilling up people and making them more climate literate in understanding what climate change means to AV into the future, albeit it can sometimes feel a little bit more far away. Being able to start the conversation and make sure that people in regions can talk to climate change impact, as well as people in our central functions, that we build it into the way that we do business in our system and processes. So the impact that we're seeking out of our climate adaptation work is that we've increased the climate resilience for AV. So when we start to see concurrent climate events happening, that we're able to respond and that we're resilient with our internal processes, as well as our external response that the community from Victoria see. As well as looking at a few case studies from Ambulance Victoria itself, I wanted to share one or two where we've been seeking input and have expanded out the network to international ambulance services. The United Kingdom is probably 5 to 10 years ahead of sustainability in ambulance services than we are here. So they did some really early work in Yorkshire Ambulance Service to lead up the development of a network of sustainability professionals across the ambulance service. And they developed things like a green passport or a green campaign of how people could be more sustainable at work and at home, and led a whole program of work around greening the ambulance service. One good example is I think they looked and did a project with the local university on design of the lights and type of the ambulance and the aerodynamics of that to reduce drag and improve fuel consumption, as well as they've looked at their property and building portfolio and design to make some improvements in that space. They're certainly one that we're looking to continue to engage with, as they also partner with London Ambulance on things like a single potential design of an ambulance vehicle as well. I haven't talked too much about vehicles today because it's not something that I have to share as many specifics, but I thought you'd like to see in the Netherlands at the UMCG ambulance organisation. They've started their journey to transition to electric vehicles about 10 years ago now with their first vehicle. And then in the interim, they've been transitioning all their smaller vehicles to electric vehicles. I think they generated a fair bit of staff interest when they had a Tesla come on board, but they now have Kia vehicles for some of their GP or referral services. And then they're awaiting a delivery at the moment of their first electric ambulance conversion from manufacturer. So we'll be waiting to hear a little bit from them on how they also transition and what they've learned with their first electric ambulance. And we've seen that in the Japanese services as well, that they've also got electric vehicles now being adopted. So for us at Ambulance Victoria, we're starting on from this year in our corporate and administration fleet of adopting hybrid vehicles, and then we'll slowly, per our plan, over the next 5 to 10 years, move into the zero emissions space for vehicles as they become available on the Australian market, which has been a little bit of a challenge compared to, for instance, the UK or the EU that have a little bit more availability for these types of vehicles. The Netherlands have also done some really good future thinking work in their zero from the grid ambulance stations. So I thought that was quite nice to share with you today. I quite like the electric robot vacuuming at the branch, but they also capture the different types of vehicle technologies that there could be in the airspace, as well as the notion of recharging and having fuel cell type vehicles and some panels on the roof. So as I mentioned before, our project with the University of Melbourne and starting to think differently about our branches, we'd be hoping to have a concept of a zero emissions branch as well quite soon. So what have we learnt in the first year of having been a sustainability team? Where are we looking forward to? Really, one of the key learnings has been that it's not just the work of one team here at Ambulance Victoria. It really does rely on working across the organisation with lots of our different departments, such as fleet and property, but also across health and learning, as I've mentioned, from the international services of where they're at, and sharing as well now where we're running projects. The sustainability business cases themselves have focused on dual drivers. So it's really about the financial, but also the environmental or the sustainable benefit. It is possible to raise cases for sustainability projects and realise responsible outcomes from both a sustainability and a financial benefit angle. Our power purchase agreement was a great example of a business case that was successful with our executive and our board to make a change, but make a change in a responsible business sense as well. So, I really encourage, if you're thinking about sustainability projects in your own service, that you do take the view of both the financial and the sustainability benefit to your senior leadership. And finally, the thing that I've been most pleased about is how engaged the staff are at AV for this work. We've had a lot of champions willingly sign up to do work locally, and a lot of people buy in and contribute to our work to date. And I really do hope that continues, because it's been fantastic to see in the last year. I won't probably focus too much on the negatives or challenges, but there are definitely a few, in that climate change is very big, and it still to some degree feels a way off, or a projection when you talk 2050 a long way off. There is a challenge there to maintain our focus on something that does feel like it's a long way away, while we're also still feeling the impacts, such as the last bushfire season, and do need to plan for it. It's also quite a broad portfolio, having so many buildings across so many locations in Victoria. The second challenge, and I'm sure a number of you would be feeling at the moment, is the waste being generated from COVID. I know, talking to some of the paramedics out there at AV, they do feel this very keenly, and the impact that it has. And look, we we are looking to work in the medium term with our infection control team to make sure that we can try where possible to embed sustainability practices into COVID response. However, respecting that infection control is obviously the most important thing, but are there any ways that we can improve either our environmental or our social impact with some of the way that we're doing things around our COVID response? But, we certainly, I would like to acknowledge of it's pretty difficult when you hear figures such as from the NHS that 500 million single-use masks have been used by the NHS in the UK since the start of the COVID-19 response. Vehicles and technologies would be our last area of challenge. So aviation, there are no easy solutions at the moment for green aviation, as well as even the road fleet of just having the time to trial vehicles and to see what's on market. We need more time to look at the different technologies coming our way. People often ask us about hydrogen as solutions as well, for example. However, that's not something that's prevalent in the Australian market as yet, and hence why the discussion of the vision for us is on a zero emissions fleet. So what do we look like in 5 years' time? If I came back to speak to you as a group, our vision is to be leading in terms of being a sustainable ambulance and a health service. And it's also a vision where sustainability would be built into things that we do on a day-to-day basis. So when I talked climate change before about different departments just taking it into their practices, be it from a business continuity or emergency response planning, my ideal is that in 5 years' time, that sustainability is everybody's responsibility and that they do take that up on a day-to-day basis. And that's that culture change that we see for sustainability practices in action at Ambulance Victoria. So we're very conscious that some of the choices that we do make today have an impact into the future and that we can make a positive difference in being a socially and environmentally responsible business. I wanted to thank you all for listening today to the presentation. I hope you've learned a little bit around sustainability at Ambulance Victoria. And I'll probably hand back over to David now because I think we've got some time for some question and answer.
Thanks, Sally. That was a great presentation. So many insights, and a massive congratulations to you and your team to have achieved so much in what is a relatively short period of time. And I know there's going to be lots of questions, hopefully, from our online participants. Can I encourage them to use the chat feature? Get those questions into us over the next 15 minutes or so. But I'd like to kick off, Sally. Look, it's an amazing journey to start, but for a lot of us, where do we start? What would be the quick win that would get the level of enthusiasm in our services that you've managed to achieve at Ambulance Victoria?
That's a great question. If I think back to probably a year or two ago for us, it was engaging with the senior leadership and getting their support. So while local projects are fantastic, what we really need as a starting point in most services is that you've got the buy-in and that there's either, if it's a one-page policy or an approach and a commitment for that you get the senior support. And that you do try and dedicate a project, even if it's just a part-time project, to explore what could a piece of work look like for your service. So I think it's the baby steps. We started with a project that was 6 to 12 months worth, and then we built the team from there.
Awesome, thank you. How did you get the teams, across quite a distributed network of stations to engage?
Well, first off, we started actually a lot with the corporate areas. So we have a working group where we meet every 2 months, and that's across some of our operational logistics and support areas, as well as more so your property and maintenance teams. But locally at the branches, we actually found it was a little bit more of we got the queries and the requests when people found out that there was a sustainability area. So it was a little bit of push and pull, to be honest. We put ourselves out there on our internal social media channels, but we did also, in developing our framework and our strategy, we followed a conscious approach of getting representatives from our operational areas. So I think we've got one of our area managers I can see on the chat today. So we did make sure we targeted some people from operations first up, so they knew we were developing the plan. I know one of our executives often said that those who make the plan don't fight the plan. So we certainly engaged early to make sure that people bought into what we were developing. And now there's not as much real pushback. It's about how do we get this done? How do we deliver on our goals?
Awesome. I've got a question on the chat group from, it was from Christina, I believe. And the question was really in relation to how did you leverage your change management expertise into the project?
I think that's because Christina knows I have change management in my background.
Insider knowledge.
Yes, I think I came at sustainability more from a change management lens than a traditional sustainability lens. And I think that was why when we engaged and we developed, it really was about building on the basics of change, that you build a team around you, you trial a few things and put it out there to groups to get feedback. So, I'm very much more of a way of working is that we are being open about what we're doing. We don't have to have all the answers, but that we need to bring people along with us. So it's not, and that's why I ended the presentation with that this is everybody's responsibility. If you're in a change management role, normally it's not one person's job to make the change, it's everybody's job at AB to be sustainable. So it's really been at the heart of how we approach all of our practices. And I would put a call out that those coloured bins have been the best thing ever to get people engaged. So I can see in the chat a few queries about the yellow, but it's certainly been a really good way of getting people started on a conversation about sustainability. Starts with waste because it's so tangible and visible to people, but then it gets you started thinking on other practices where you could become more sustainable at a local level as well.
Talking about leadership, your chief executive, Tony Walker, is obviously a giant in relation to mental health issues, a Twitter phenomena. How did you turn him into an eco-warrior?
I'm not quite sure how we've done it so far, but we're certainly chipping away at Tony to I think Ambulance Victoria generally likes to be a leader in things. So, I think when we can put it out there that we can respond to what our people are valuing, and that we can be a leader in this space and help share, then I think that's an easy sell. I don't think you need to convince anyone really around that. It's good business practice and it's a responsible way of working. So I don't think you need to convince people around that. I think it's just the right thing to do in the first place. Yeah,
absolutely. Timing is key as well, I guess.
Yeah.
Are there any other low-hanging fruit that you've kind of experienced on this journey that you'd recommend people could grab that opportunity to get, commitment from staff and leadership alike?
I think waste, as we've been mentioning, has been really engaging, but I think there are small things that you can do around just starting to have conversations. So we're looking at a module at the moment that's coming from government on clinical waste and looking at what are gaps in paramedic or frontline staff capabilities where we can. So how can we add value to people's practice? So we're certainly also looking at it away from people's practice or community continuing education of how that can work. The other low-hanging fruit for us is small and large purchasing. So you can reach social and environmental outcomes from how and what we buy and how we dispose of it at end of life. So we're really exploring a few good opportunities there, and that can be done locally for how you dispose of things from a local branch, but also how centrally you buy and engage in large value contracts.
One of the aspects we were really keen to explore, I came through it in our initial bit of research, was really around water use and water recycling and water collection. What's AV's thoughts in this space?
It's interesting you bring up water, because in the last 12 months we said we're going to hold on water until this year. We've been focused on energy and putting together a lot of plans around emissions and climate change, but water is probably that next topic for even us to have a look at in more detail. We do install tanks in our new branches, and we've got some good practices generally on some retrofit for some simple actions. But yeah, it's probably now that next step to look at water in more detail, because it obviously is a precious resource and fits that priority area for us.
Absolutely. And I'm very excited to see the outcome of your 100% green power. I think that's going to provide a lot of interest to our other ambulance services and other chief execs. And I guess the proof of the pudding is going to be the reduction in your power bill, which I imagine could be significant.
It could be, and I think also we see it as future proofing. So if zero emissions vehicles or greener vehicles are going to need to be charged with green power to realise the environmental benefit, then this is a stepping stone for our fleet transition as well. So that's why energy for us was a first priority for looking at our energy transition to then enable the rest of the emissions or low carbon transition.
That's great. How can we stay in touch and get regular updates from you? Because we're keen to be partners in this amazing journey you and AV are on.
I would be happy to come back anytime and talk to the group, but you can also contact us at sustainability@ambulance.vic.gov.au, and obviously through the AV social media channels. So please feel free to get in contact. A big call out as well. There's another member of the team, Catherine, who joined us a year ago, and she and the rest of the AV team have done a fantastic bulk of work in this space.
That's great. And I'd encourage people to take up that offer. So, Sally, thanks so much for your time. Thanks for a really interesting and really essential conversation a lot of us need to be having. Congratulations again to you and your team for the progress you made, and to Ambulance Victoria as an organisation for leading the charge in this area also. So it's wonderful to see. Can I remind our participants that you can gain a CDP, a Continuing Professional Development Point, for participating in the seminar. The information for getting that is on the site. I'd like to also remind you that our next webinar in the series is on the 27th of October. We're going to be talking to Dr. Elizabeth Berryman. Liz is a clinician in Auckland, New Zealand, and Liz's experience as a young doctor and moving into the health profession exposed her to some trauma and stuff, and as a result she's spent a lot of time working with some really smart people to develop an app for mental health, particularly for healthcare workers and healthcare professionals. The app's called Channel. The CAA is working with Liz to roll out the app across some of the ambulance services in the CAA membership over the next couple of months. Particularly during COVID, we think this is a great opportunity to help support the frontline workforce in having an app that helps them check in on their mental health regularly. So look, I look forward to seeing some of you on the 27th of October. It's going to be a really interesting chat and a really important and, again, very poignant conversation to have as a sector. So I'd like to thank you all. Thanks for participating, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you for attending the Sustainability in Ambulance Victoria webinar supported by Mercedes-Benz. And keep up to date by following us on Twitter at the Council of AM1, or on LinkedIn and Facebook, Council of Ambulance Authorities Australasia. We look forward to seeing you next time.